Good morning. I'd like today to address the question of how we might make our advocacy for gifted children more effective. When Gifted NZ was launched 11 years ago at a conference in Rotorua, it represented a very significant development in the history of gifted education in this country. For the very first time, an organisation was founded specifically to represent the interests and concerns of teachers involved in this field. As most of us know, gifted education has always been the poor relation in our education system. There had been a few short-lived blips of official interest, but for the most part, these children were consigned to the category labelled "can safely be ignored." Since that time, while still in the minority, many more teachers have gradually become actively involved in advocating for gifted learners. And now, to our relief, we have an Associate Minister of Education who has raised the flag for the gifted, has directed that the needs of gifted learners should be included in the work of learning support coordinators, and has asked her ministry to develop some specific programs for gifted learners. But it is not enough. Virtually all these initiatives are for children, and they are or can be outside the normal provisions of school. Wonderful as they are, they do not necessarily change teacher perceptions or practice within the classroom. We might ask, what about the learning support coordinators? Surely they will make a difference. Potentially, yes. But where's the training? Some 5 PLD awards spread amongst ultimately some 600 learning support coordinators is hardly conducive to wholesale transformation of understanding. The assumption seems to be that somehow learning support coordinators will have already acquired the necessary skills to identify and support gifted learners. There is no basis for that assumption. It is still the case that relatively few teachers in this country, including those who become learning support coordinators, will have had adequate or indeed any training and understanding giftedness in their professional education. This very omission leads to the type of response we saw at the ULearn conference just last year, where the very first person to approach Deb Walker at the Gifted Aotearoa stand was a man who marched up, bluntly stated, "I don't believe in gifted education," turned and marched self-righteously away. I won't tire you with any more examples like this, though sadly I could. I don't need to, because most of us will have seen for ourselves illustrations of this attitude. The teachers who think it's just pushy parents, that it's elitism, that gifted kids only come from upper income families, that they can succeed without any support or provision. Or, of course, alternatively, that all kids are gifted, anyone can be if they try hard, etc., etc. These are still widely prevalent views. In short, in this country, giftedness is all too often seen only through the distorted lens of misinformed stereotypes. I've been thinking about this, and I've been wondering recently whether we ourselves as teachers with an interest in gifted learners might have unwittingly contributed to this desperately unhelpful state of affairs. And I think we have. I think we ourselves have unintentionally confined and limited our sphere of influence, that we've marked out for ourselves a territory whose boundaries are too narrow for the scope of the vision we should truly have for these children. And I think we've done this because we have largely centred our consideration of provision for giftedness on school learning and school experience. Now, by that, I don't just mean academic learning and performance in that arena, though there are those writers, notably François Garnier, who do claim that this should be our aim or prime concern, And there are those schools who still use measurable academic performance as either their sole identification tool or as the sole measure of the effectiveness of their provision for gifted students. So, let us say at once that academic performance will always have significance and that opportunities for gifted learners to achieve academically will always be integral to gifted provision. That's not in question. But for decades now, we have acknowledged that giftedness can occur in a wide range of other learning areas, and in more recent years, at least some working in this field have drawn attention to the ways in which giftedness shapes a child's perceptions and responses, and hence the potential impact on emotional, social, and ethical development. Nevertheless, as teachers, our focus has still basically been on how these things relate to what we do in school. We make decisions about matters such as whether or not to allow acceleration, whether we should set up a withdrawal group or concentrate on achieving an inclusive classroom program, what our guidelines should be for deciding a child is gifted. We ask questions such as how can we help the gifted child hampered by perfectionism? Whether that supposedly gifted but wildly uncooperative child should be allowed into the gifted program, how to provide for a child who is creatively gifted when we ourselves have perhaps more thumbs than fingers. All these are very relevant questions for both teachers and management. What's more, it seems entirely reasonable that a teacher's question should be within the context of school. This is where the teacher functions, where the teacher has responsibility. And for sure, teachers have enough to do already without adding anything more. But fundamental to the reality of our profession is the fact that childhood is essentially one phase within the full lifetime, a crucial and extended phase, but one whose significance we cannot fully grasp unless we have also a concept of the wholeness of that individual being, of what is innate to that person, of how each lived experience entwines itself with that person's perceptions, threads into present and future responses, and helps construct that future life. In a word, the outcomes of schooling do not end with schooling itself. So, how can we realistically embrace this larger understanding? We've seen that there's already been a movement in this direction. Once, the focus for teachers of the gifted was all on excellence, achievement, and success. That focus, as Miller and Silverman and indeed others have pointed out, neglected to consider the actual child. It is an approach which has been, at least partly, if not largely, responsible for the accusations of elitism which have undermined attempts to provide for the gifted and ensured its mutual invisibility in teacher education. But deeper thinking about the actuality of giftedness, coming initially from the work of people like Dabrowski, Hollingworth and Roper, has led us towards a radically different child-centred approach, one which recognises the intrinsic nature of giftedness in the child's psyche and acknowledges it as the pervading influence that it is on so much of the child's life. Thus we are led to ask, not just what can this child do, but more searchingly, who is this child? How can we know this unique individual? It's here that I want to suggest one further step. Once we accept the concept of childhood as a phase within the whole concept of a life, then in our teaching role, we must both look back to what came before this child came to us and look forward to what lies ahead and consider our part in the shaping of that evolving future life. In gifted education, we are beginning to become much more alert to the importance of those early years before the child starts school. But we have done comparatively little to look ahead. As a community, we have not yet found a widely accepted way of enlarging that narrow focus on success. And until we can do this, gifted education will remain trapped in a remote and largely ignored niche within teacher education. Nor have we looked beyond the school gate to the whole life function of the gifted individual. Still, our focus is essentially inwards towards what happens in school. But if we take that longer view, then our work with these children becomes relevant far beyond the education community, and we may hope to gain a more effective range of allies in seeking better provision for them. It's at this point that we can most clearly distinguish between those definitions of giftedness which set the goal of gifted education primarily as success for the individual's self, and on the other hand, a definition which sees the formation of a life vision as the ultimate goal of gifted education, a vision going beyond self-interest to the wider purpose of that individual's whole life within the community in which he or she lives. To discover this second definition, we must go back to our conceptualization of giftedness. Your experience and mine, and the experience of all the parents at this conference, all solidly confirm what research has also discovered. Giftedness is an inherent attribute, implicit from the moment of conception, present at birth, and potentially evident at times even in infancy. I myself have a niece who terrified her parents by starting to use words at the age of 4 months. But giftedness is not just about a sometimes startling capacity to learn and perform much more quickly than most other children. That is simply an outcome of something far more profound, namely the whole way in which a gifted individual perceives and experiences life, from those early infant years and throughout childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. Unless we comprehend this, we cannot adequately respond to the very different needs of the gifted child we teach. Dabrowski gave us a crucial starting point for understanding this. His research brought into focus the extraordinary intensity which so significantly distinguishes the perceptions and reactions of gifted individuals from the rest of us. At even the most everyday level, where others might feel happy or sad, the gifted child may feel joy or despair. Where others are cross, they are furious. Where others are interested, they can be wholly absorbed, and so on. When such differences come into play in larger or more sustained areas of life, then inevitably their impact is far-reaching. In particular, we can distinguish 3 key areas where this difference impacts on the responses of the gifted individual: the qualities, abilities, and traits which characterize that individual. Now, I don't think any of us will dispute the inclusion of abilities in this list. Exceptional ability in one field or another, or in several, developed or potential, is quite clearly a necessary component of any definition of giftedness. But why qualities? And why first? The reason is one of those things that's so obvious that you really wonder why it wasn't there in the first place. In a nutshell, the qualities a person has determine the way in which he or she uses the abilities he or she has. Hitler, for example, undoubtedly had great ability as a leader, but his personal qualities led to the use of those abilities in deeply evil ways, driven by his self-centered desire for supreme power. We might well think there is more than one contemporary political example of the same lust for power. Contrast that with the lives of people like Nelson Mandela, Sister Teresa, William Wilberforce, Malala Yousafzai, Greta Thunberg. In our own country, people like Dame Fina Cooper and Sam Johnson, all people driven by concerns beyond and sometimes at the cost of their own needs, using their abilities to serve larger aims. It is enormously important to acknowledge here that this recognition of the primacy of qualities comes directly from the Maori concept of giftedness, which rates qualities above abilities and links this order of priorities to an ethic of caring and an expectation that abilities will be used in the service of the community, infused with a spiritual awareness quite absent from most Western definitions. This is a point of great significance for Aotearoa New Zealand. Our traditional interpretation of giftedness has lived a largely separate life from our equally traditional belief in child-centred learning. As well, we have almost completely overlooked the enormous potential value of bringing our dual cultural heritage together into a concept of giftedness of unique richness and meaning. Any definition which is going to be appropriate for our country should surely reflect this dual heritage. I would ask you to give deep thought to that point beyond today's discussion. Then there is the third element, traits. In other words, those behaviours which are characteristic of a particular individual, if you like, his or her particular idiosyncrasies. We all have these, but, as you would expect, gifted children are likely to have them more intensively. For example, one gifted child might have an irrepressible need to be fiddling with some object when they're thinking hard. One might adore making puns in all sorts of circumstances, appropriate and inappropriate. Another might have a passion for jigsaws and creates her own. Another is fascinated by insect life and brings it into almost every lesson topic, likely and unlikely. One outcome of this complex interplay of qualities, abilities and traits is that it can produce quite substantially asynchronous development. The 8-year-old, whose exceptional ability allows her to read at a 12-year-old level, might have interests so far removed from those of her age peers that no one wants to play with her, and her social skills remain immature. In fact, one little girl I heard about, who was making no friends at school, was advised by her mother to take her Barbie doll to be like the other girls. She did, but came home dejected. Why? Well, she explained, all the other girls wanted to play Ken and Barbie, and I wanted to play Queen Cleopatra of the Nile. Such asynchrony not only influences how the child behaves, it also influences the child's needs. Just as exceptional ability creates a need for appropriate challenge, so exceptional concern for example, issues of justice or exceptional distress over examples of cruelty to other living things calls for sympathetic adult acceptance and support. The gifted class clown and the gifted child reluctant to show ability in a group need different kinds of support too, and so on. But as we all know from our own observations, it's differences in behaviour which get noticed by other children. Their responses will often reflect their lack of comprehension of the gifted child's more intense reactions, more complex ideas, more persistent questioning. Whether that response is positively accepting, largely indifferent, or actively negative, the gifted child will almost always be conscious of some gap between him or herself and age peers. He or she somehow just doesn't quite fit. Adult responses may underscore that perception. However the gifted child deals with this, it contributes to the sense of self, of identity, which is evolving during these years. And that, I think, is the point that we have missed. Already more sensitive than most and more deeply thoughtful, it's hardly surprising to find a gifted child reflecting on what he or she sees and experiences and developing a set of personal values, and from this beginning to form some sort of sense of life direction, some idea of how he or she wants to live that life. It's a process which begins young. For example, I remember reading a set of stories written by 8-year-olds about friends. All but one described what their friends looked like and what they liked to do together. The exception, a gifted child, asked, "What is a friend?" and went on to write thoughtfully about the value of friendship. Indeed, we can often see heightened sensitivity to values issues even in gifted preschoolers, the ones who at 3 or 4 years old intervene to stop another child being bullied, decide to stop eating animals even though their families still do, send their own favourite toy to a local collection for children whose house has been burnt down, and so on. It is surely a natural evolution for children such as these to begin to develop that life vision I mentioned earlier, that sense of having a meaningful purpose to drive towards, a purpose informed by those emerging values, and thus going beyond satisfaction for self to a larger concern, bringing qualities and abilities together to achieve the fulfillment of that purpose. Thus, we begin with a holistic understanding of the gifted child, and we contribute over time through our teaching to the formation of a life vision which may ultimately find its expression in forms such as creation, invention, service, or leadership. This approach has significant implications for curriculum. Here, surely, is where we see both future and community problem solving, philosophy for children, and events like ethics conferences, all as essential ingredients for all gifted learners. To these, I would add a knowledge of the systems of democracy and government and an understanding of civic responsibilities, a territory currently woefully neglected in much of our education system. I would build study units relating to some of the inspirational leaders of our own informed times, and I would encourage gifted students to believe in their own capacity to work for change in society. I would teach not only debating, but also advocacy skills, and I would look in depth at the mechanisms of change. I would expect each gifted student over time to identify matters that concern them within their own community and to become involved in projects that lead to better outcomes. I would support them in beginning to identify their own wider life vision. Can these things happen? Yes. In my own doctoral research, what was strongly evident was that gifted young people were, on their own initiative, seeking out exactly such opportunities. Why can we not support this process? If we can introduce entrepreneurial skills to promote business acumen, why not those skills which promote social and civic well-being? Lastly, I spoke earlier of seeking allies. Most of our advocacy has been directed towards our teaching colleagues and towards the ministry, but there are many other people whose activities directly or indirectly affect what happens for our gifted children. At present, little provision is made for such people to become aware of their potential ability to make a difference. Here, I want to suggest to you, is where we could reach out and seek to create a larger support base for our advocacy, building on our holistic and lifelong understanding of giftedness. Think, for example, of the paediatricians who still at times misdiagnose giftedness as ADHD or OCD or other such conditions because no one in their medical training has ever taught them how to recognise the behaviour of a gifted learner. Think of ERO, which officially recognises the requirement for schools to provide for gifted learners, but whose officers still write reports which never mention the topic. Think of both educational and clinical psychologists. Their training, too, does not routinely include the gifted, nor does that of school counsellors, who can be the first point of referral for the apparently difficult but actually frustrated gifted student. What about career guidance, especially if we're looking on to future life? The most recent ministry publication I could find on this topic was dated 2009, and there was one-line reference in 55 pages to gifted students. Then, too, are we doing enough to target school management? Could we do more to infiltrate subject associations? Outside school, many gifted children have found the local librarian to be their very best friend. But do librarians in general get any advice on recognising and supporting such children? We hear at times of impressive work being done by an individual or agency, such as the splendid Marine Centre in Dunedin. Could we do more to use their example in our advocacy? There are many local amateur groups in a huge range of fields. Could we encourage schools to liaise with more of these groups? Chess clubs have often set an example here, but what about other interest areas? Can we involve service clubs, not just in occasionally providing some funding for a specific child or event, but in creating opportunities for young children to experience service activities under the guidance of these clubs as mentors? All of these things create a wider and stronger base for advocacy, but could also contribute to shaping the child's adult future life. Gifted NZ is a small association. With the best will in the world, its board could not unilaterally undertake the type of program I've suggested here. But could Gifted NZ act as a coordinator of such advocacy, working with members to identify potential target groups, providing training for members in advocacy, prepare more specifically oriented position statements, act as the authoritative voice behind individual members undertaking advocacy? Could Gifted NZ consider giving learning support coordinators free membership for 1 year, for example? Can we now, today, give Gifted NZ our support for such a process? So, in closing, I submit that achieving the best future for our gifted children involves a deeper appreciation and awareness of the holistic and lifelong nature of giftedness, recognition of the development of a life vision as a goal for our work in this field, and a sustained broadening of our advocacy on behalf of these children now and for their future lives. Thank you.